On behalf of the Socialist Equality Party, the Australian section of the International Committee of the Fourth International, I would like to welcome everyone participating in this meeting, whether you are here in our Sydney venue or online across Australia, in New Zealand and other countries as we carry out live streaming. My name is Linda Tenenbaum and I'm a member of the National Committee of the Socialist Equality Party, and I will be chairing today's event. I'd like to begin by making a few introductory remarks on the topic of this meeting: the new foreign interference laws moving towards dictatorship and war. These remarks will be followed by a report delivered by our main speaker this afternoon, James Cogan, the National Secretary of the Socialist Equality Party. After James's report, we will take up a collection for the SEP's $25,000 monthly fund and then open the meeting for questions and discussion. For those participating online, please note that due to the time constraints of Facebook Live video, we will be ending this stream when James finishes his report and beginning a new stream several minutes later to enable you to participate in the question and answer session. So please be patient as we make the transition. Exactly 4 weeks ago, the Socialist Equality Party held a rally in Sydney's Town Hall Square to demand of Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull's government that it use its diplomatic power and legal discretion under both international and Australian law to free Julian Assange and repatriate him to Australia with a guarantee against extradition to the United States. Assange has been holed up in the Ecuadorian embassy in London for 6 years. He has never been charged with any crime, but has been slandered as a rapist in order to justify his ongoing repression at the hands of the Australian, American, British and now Ecuadorian governments. As far as they are concerned, his crime is that he published information from courageous whistleblowers through his media organisation WikiLeaks that has enraged the ruling elites and their military intelligence apparatus in every country. They want him silenced. His most fundamental legal and democratic rights have been trashed in the process. As of today, for the past 110 days, Julian has been deprived of all communication and visitors in a vindictive attempt orchestrated by Britain, the US and Ecuador to compel him to leave the Ecuadorian embassy where he was granted asylum in London, thereby facing potential extradition to the US, where he would be forced to stand trial on false charges of espionage, charges that in the United States can attract the death penalty. The Socialist Equality Party held the June 17 rally, which was supported by journalist John Pilger and other prominent defenders of freedom of speech, as part of the fight being waged by our international movement, the ICFI, to build a powerful campaign oriented to workers and young people in Australia, New Zealand and internationally in defence of freedom of speech, civil liberties and against internet censorship. We explained that the persecution of Julian Assange, an Australian citizen, and WikiLeaks, a global organisation, was part of a worldwide attack on the social and democratic rights of the working class, with immensely dangerous implications. The passage of the new foreign interference laws by the Australian Federal Parliament confirms our warning in what represents nothing less than a move towards authoritarianism and the state repression of dissent. The coalition Liberal National Government and the Labor opposition rammed the 150-page legislation through both Houses of Parliament in just 3 days, between June 26 and June 28 this year. These laws have been passed under conditions where the population has been kept in the dark. The World Socialist website, the internet centre of the ICFI, is virtually the only news outlet that has covered the new legislation. Its contents its preparation and passage through both houses of Parliament, and its far-reaching implications. The establishment media has remained silent on this historic assault on democratic rights. The legislation consists of two separate acts, which have already been given the obligatory royal assent by the Governor-General, Sir Peter Cosgrove, a former high-ranking military general and head of the armed forces. These acts have been drafted as amendments to the existing Crimes Act. The first act is the Espionage and Foreign Interference Act, EFI, and the second is the Foreign Influence Transparency Scheme, the FITS Act. The two acts comprise the most extensive anti-democratic legislation in Australia since World War II. It is important to recall that during both World Wars, the government of the day in this country suppressed opposition by decree via sweeping regulations that included powers to intern so-called aliens, Italians, Germans, in the Second World War, Japanese, indefinitely without trial. Under the new legislation, foreign interference is defined as engaging in conduct on behalf of or in collaboration with a foreign principal or person acting on behalf of a foreign principal, and influencing a political government or governmental process is a crime where any part of the conduct is covert or involves deception. Jail terms for these new crimes attract penalties of up to 20 years. The two main purposes of the foreign interference laws are, firstly, to promote an hysterical nationalist and xenophobic climate in preparation for Australian involvement in a US-led war against China, and secondly, to criminalise opposition by the working class to both the drive to war and the escalating assault on its living standards. The EFI Act, the Espionage and Foreign Interference Act, features 45 new or expanded criminal offences and penalties of up to life imprisonment. These range from treason to sabotage and to dealing with information that harms Australian national security. For example, the number and type of offences deemed to involve treason, treachery, mutiny, sabotage, espionage, or violation of secrecy has expanded, and penalties for these offences have been increased. Most significantly, the Espionage and Foreign Interference Act creates an entirely new crime, foreign interference, which has never existed before in Australia or, with one or two exceptions, in any other country. Foreign interference actually refers to a broad range of new criminal offences involving different types of cooperation between Australian individuals and organisations with overseas entities or foreign principals. Its immediate purpose is to intimidate and criminalise organisations in Australia that associate, do business with, or collaborate in any way with Chinese nationals, especially those in any way related to the ruling Chinese Communist Party. Such relationships can now be deemed to be enabling foreign interference aimed at influencing Australian politics. Those involved can be charged under the Act and face heavy jail sentences. Bob Carr, for example, could be a target of these laws for working in a Chinese-funded academic institution and being opposed to the war, to some extent against China. Under the second Act, the Foreign Influence Transparency Scheme Act, the government will set up a public register in June 2019, next year, for any Australian political, media or advocacy organisations that maintain international relations with what is defined as a foreign principal, purportedly attempting to influence Australian politics. The penalty for failing to register or for failing to comply with the complex reporting requirements under this Act, this is the penalty for any Australian individual or organisation, will be 5 years jail. The Fitz Act exempts private banks and corporations, trade unions and business associations, non-political charities and organised religion from having to register. So it's pretty clear that the Act's specific target is political organisations, which could range from Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, environmental movements, refugee advocacy groups, and registered political parties, such as the Socialist Equality Party. If, for example, a political organisation, a party, a human rights organisation, or an environmental group organises a rally in coalition with international co-thinkers to fight for social or political rights, that organisation can be deemed to be covertly working to influence Australian politics. It would have to register and allow government officials to rifle through its communications, activities, meetings, and so on, all its documents, in order to determine whether or not it should be charged under the FE Act for interfering in Australian politics. Of course, if a major global corporation, such as GMH, for example, takes decisions in collaborations with its overseas foreign directors that influence or rather determine, that is, takes decisions that influence or rather determine the lives and future income, health, housing and education of hundreds of thousands of workers, it is highly unlikely that it would have to register under FITS. In fact, it would be, one imagines, exempt. This legislation has a specific class agenda and specific targets. Those who interfere with, that is, who oppose government policy and who collaborate with overseas supporters and co-thinkers in doing so from the standpoint of the interests of the working class. Under the Act, the Attorney General must provide written assent for any charges to be approved. The catch is that until that assent is either granted or denied, the individual or individuals charged can be held in prison for an indefinite period. The FITS legislation defines national security in sweeping terms as the protection of the integrity of the country's territory and borders from serious threats, but also the country's political, military or economic relations with another country or other countries. I mean, you can't get much broader than that. Such wording could be read as implying that the US-Australia alliance, under which the Australian and global population is being dragged into a potential nuclear catastrophe, is now deemed part of national security. An anti-war demonstration addressed by international speakers, for example, could be assessed as harmful to Canberra's political, military and economic relations with the United States, and those involved charged and jailed. Foreign principal is likewise defined in a broad and vague fashion. It includes foreign governments, bodies, state-owned entities and political organisations. Note the reference to China. State-owned entities. A foreign political organisation is defined as a foreign political party or a foreign organisation that exists to pursue political objectives. But a foreign political organisation is also defined as a foreign organisation that exists to pursue militant, extremist or revolutionary objectives. Of course, it will be the ruling elite, including its military intelligence and police agencies, that determines the definition of militant, extremist or revolutionary. Does this description cover WikiLeaks? Would it apply to Edward Snowden, who exposed criminal government surveillance techniques? The legislation has been introduced, after all, on top of a whole gamut of anti-democratic anti-terror legislation since 2002. Why is it needed? To deal with whistleblowers, any critical media, opponents of war, and opponents of the US-Australian alliance. In February 2003, Andrew Wilkie, then an Australian intelligence officer, resigned from his position and publicly denounced the claims that Iraq was concealing weapons of mass destruction. His statements contributed to the mass demonstrations in Australia and internationally against the impending Iraq war. The huge anti-war movement that erupted throughout Australia and the world had the potential to lead to widespread democratic calls for an end to the political and military relations with the United States. But in 2003, there was no means under Australian law to charge Wilkie with any crime. What would likely happen now under the new foreign interference laws? Could Wilkie be charged with espionage for exposing the fact that the US and Australia were preparing an illegal war of aggression based on information from foreign organisations? Could his actions be labelled a threat to the country's political, military or economic relations with another country, that is, with the United States, under conditions where both Australia and the US are in the process of preparing another war, this time against China? Let us take the example once more of Julian Assange. In 2010, in his capacity as editor of WikiLeaks, Assange published leaks made by a courageous American soldier which exposed US war crimes, lies and diplomatic conspiracies, making this information available to the Australian and world population. Labor Party Prime Minister Julia Gillard declared that WikiLeaks had engaged in illegal activity. The legal profession and the media rejected that characterisation because under Australian laws, nothing Assange and WikiLeaks had done was in fact illegal. They had, as a media organisation and its editor, published leaks, not leaked them. What does WikiLeaks face under the new foreign interference legislation? Could it be classified not as media, but as a foreign organisation seeking to influence Australian politics by exposing the extent of US intrigues in this country and by revealing its numerous war crimes? After all, in the United States last year, the director of the CIA defined WikiLeaks as a non-state hostile intelligence agency, not a media organisation. If WikiLeaks were defined in such fashion here, then Assange, an Australian citizen, could potentially be charged with espionage for assisting it to publish the leaks and sent to jail for 25 years. We can only give you an initial sense of the extent of this legislation here. The critical question is, why, on top of the wide powers contained in the barrage of anti-terror legislation, does the government feel the need to legislate against foreign intervention and interference into Australian political life? The reason is that it is terrified of the rising anger, hostility and disaffection among millions of people toward the entire official political establishment. More than 3 decades of swingeing cuts to the living standards and social rights of the vast mass of the population around the world will erupt, and is beginning to erupt, into major rebellions by the working class against poverty and unemployment, against the privatisation and cutbacks in public education, health, aged services, housing and health. Above all, both the government and opposition, Labor opposition, are well aware of the opposition that a war with China will foment. They have read the survey results showing that a very significant majority of young people prefer socialism to capitalism, and this too is a worldwide phenomenon. The government is seeking to intimidate and scare this incipient rebellion, rendering the legislation so broad and vague that most people would not even know whether they were committing a crime or not. And it is acting under pressure, under immense pressure to do so from its US ally. Our task is to prepare for the eruption of class struggle that will inevitably emerge by building the Socialist Equality Party as the new socialist and internationalist leadership of the working class. The main speaker today is James Cogan, the National Secretary of the Socialist Equality Party. James has been a member of this party for nearly 3 decades and is a leading member of the World Socialist website editorial board in Australia, writing articles to clarify the international working class on a wide range of political, social and historical issues. He will review the context and historical background of the drafting of the new foreign interference legislation and the political perspective of the SEP to oppose it. Please give him a very warm welcome.
I think, as we've begun to make clear, the new foreign interference laws are certainly the outcome of protracted and relentless intrigue into official Australian politics, but not by China. As a significant proportion of the Australian population already knows, or at least suspects, the main perpetrators of foreign interference and foreign influence over Australian politics is the White House, the Pentagon, and the military intelligence agencies of US imperialism. These laws, pushed through in just 3 days, are intended to create the legal means for the mass repression of opposition in Australia to the country's involvement in a US-led military conflict with China. They are intended and viewed as a model for similar legislation in the United States itself and in other countries such as New Zealand, Canada, Japan, Britain, others. Now, the origins of the new laws can be traced back to the response of the American ruling elite to the breakdown that took place in global financial and economic relations in 2008. As the crisis developed throughout that year, threatening to collapse the entire edifice of financial speculation that had come to dominate over American and world capitalism, and from which the ruling class derives much of its ill-gotten wealth, a very conscious decision was made in the United States establishment to back the coming to power of the Democratic Party candidate for president, Barack Obama. A campaign was conducted to promote illusions that the first black president would bring about, as he claimed, hope and change, an end to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and to the thuggery and gangsterism that had defined the Bush-Cheney administration. The promise was held out that Obama would do something to alleviate the staggering and ever-widening levels of social inequality and poverty gripping the American people. Now, the aim of this conscious promotion of Obama was twofold. Firstly, it was to try and prevent, through the stoking of illusions, an eruption of social unrest against the failure of American capitalism and the outright criminality of the financial and corporate billionaire oligarchs that it serves. But behind the backs of the American people, Obama was also backed by the ruling class because they wanted a new administration that would shift American foreign policy away from the quagmire in the Middle East to a focus on what the American capitalist elite had come to agree was its greatest threat. That is, as America's global position deteriorated and declined, the United States ruling class viewed the growing economic, political, and military influence of China and its new capitalist elite as its greatest danger. Now, with Obama elected, the American government policies begun certainly in the final months of Bush, but then escalated under Obama, handed literally trillions of dollars over to the financial and corporate oligarchs through bailouts, loans, other rescue operations. Far from hope and change, workers and young people in the United States and across Europe and numerous other countries were inflicted as a result with savage attacks on their jobs, wages, working conditions, and savage austerity against their health care systems, their education systems, and their other social rights. At the same time, literally within weeks of Barack Obama's inauguration, his administration began aggressively preparing for an open policy of direct confrontation with China. Of course, while continuing both the war in Iraq and increasing US military operations in Afghanistan. Now, the turn to a focus on China initially took the following form. It was to ensure that the key US allies in the Asia-Pacific region, specifically Japan, Australia, South Korea, and New Zealand, regional powers such as India, and strategically positioned countries such as the Philippines and Vietnam were thoroughly integrated into the US plans. The situation in 2009 was that the United States could not be sure that it would receive support from any of its allies in the Asia-Pacific region. In Japan and in Australia, as well as in numerous countries across Asia, aligning with the United States against China was viewed with tremendous concern in significant sections of the business and political establishment. By 2009, China had become the largest trading partner of virtually every country in the region, including Australia. Powerful corporate interests were generating immense profits from either directly participating in the ruthless exploitation of the multi-million Chinese working class in the cheap labour manufacturing zones, or, as in the case of the Australian capitalist class, generating billions in profit from the sale of raw materials such as iron ore and coal to fuel China's growing industries. The US, by contrast, was in stark and obvious decline. Moreover, as a result of the illegal invasion of Iraq, there was considerable popular opposition internationally, and certainly in this country, to any government giving support to another militarist agenda of the United States. Now, thanks to the courageous whistleblower in the US military, Chelsea, formerly Private Bradley Manning, and thanks to WikiLeaks and Julian Assange, who published those leaks, we know something of the behind closed doors intrigues that took place to change the situation in the Asia Pacific in the interests of the United States, of US imperialism. From the time it took office, we know that the Obama administration viewed then Australian Labor Party Prime Minister Kevin Rudd with suspicion and really outright distrust. While the wing of the Australian business and political elite, represented by Rudd's government, was no less hostile than Obama and the US establishment to China becoming the dominant power in Asia, it did not agree with taking actions that could be viewed by China as hostile acts by Australia to Chinese interests. In 2008, for example, Kevin Rudd and his government rejected any Australian participation in what is now known as the Quadrilateral, That is a loosely defined alliance to develop closer military relations between the US, Australia, Japan and India against China, and within that framework, closer military collaboration between Australia and Japan and Australia and India, a policy known as the spokes and wheels. The wheel is the United States, the spokes, the different countries all assist one another, contribute to the overall US strategy. Instead of supporting the quadrilateral, Rudd proposed instead a new regional body, which he called the Asia-Pacific Community, in which China would enjoy equal status with the United States. As discussions began on the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade agreement from 2008 on, it was also expected in Washington that Rudd would advocate strongly for China to be included, whereas the United States wanted China excluded. Now, in March 2009, the following US diplomatic cable was sent from the Australian Embassy detailing a top-level meeting that took place between Kevin Rudd and Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. This cable was among the 250,000 published by WikiLeaks in November, December 2010. I don't know if you can read it, but what Rudd argued, the US Embassy notes, quote, Rudd argued for multilateral engagement with bilateral vigour, integrating China effectively into the international community and allowing it to demonstrate greater responsibility, all while also preparing to deploy force if everything goes wrong. Now, as I said earlier, Rudd and the Australian establishment were always hostile to China emerging as a dominant factor in the region and challenging Australian strategic interests, but they were arguing, as is clear from this, that compromise had to be made by the United States to allow China to play a far greater role. That was not the US agenda. With the exception of preparing to deploy force, there is nothing in what Rudd said that the Obama administration agreed. It had no intention then, and US imperialism still has no intention now, of treating China as an equal in the region or internationally. Nor was it going to allow Australia, Japan, or other key allies drift out of Washington's dominance and orbit into closer relations with Beijing. Now, in June 2009, in another top secret cable, the US Embassy in Canberra favourably compared Deputy Prime Minister Julia Gillard with Rudd. It highlighted Rudd's so-called volatility, especially in foreign affairs, and the extent to which he was seeking to exert control over the decisions of the government against the advice of the senior foreign policy bureaucrats. The embassy was in close discussion with key figures in the Labor Party and the trade unions. People it classified as its, quote, protected sources. These included Bill Shorten, key factional heavyweight Senator Mark Arbib and David Feeney, and Australian Workers' Union National Secretary Paul Howes. These individuals secretly provided the US Embassy with regular updates on internal government discussions and on divisions within the leadership of the Labor Party government. Now, in 2009, November 2009, the head of the US Embassy, Dan Clune, sent the Obama administration a report on the Rudd government. It was scathing. Clune declared that Rudd's haphazard, overly secretive decision-making process would continue to result in, quote, mistakes on Australian foreign policy. he named as Rudd's first major mistake the decision not to take part in the US proposed quadrilateral. Now, there is next to no question that the US government and its protected sources within the Labor Party were conspiring to launch a leadership challenge to remove Rudd as soon as political conditions made it possible. And we can be sure that a parallel process of US intrigue was taking place at the same time in Japan. Japan's then Democratic Party Prime Minister, Yukio Hadoyama, was pursuing what was described as a, quote, shift away from an American-centric foreign policy to a more Asia-focused policy. He was seeking to improve Japanese relations with China. He had ended Japanese participation in the war in Afghanistan. Now, we do not have the diplomatic cables to prove it, but we can state with a high degree of probability that a conspiracy against Hadoyama was underway just as extensive, if not more so, given the greater weight of Japan in world affairs, than the intrigues taking place against Rudd. Now, in May 2010, Hadoyama's own party, senior figures in his own government, forced him to abandon an election promise he had made, a popular election promise, to wind down the large US base on Okinawa. On June 2nd, 2010, lacking any support in his own government, he resigned. Over the years since, Japan has lurched into open militarism and anti-China policies under all subsequent governments, especially under the current ultra-nationalist Liberal Democratic Party Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. Now, 21 days after Hadoyama resigned, on the evening of June 23rd, 2010, a political coup was launched in the Australian Labor Party to oust Kevin Rudd as Prime Minister and install Julia Gillard. Rudd was certainly under ferocious attack by big business over moves to impose a so-called mining industry super profits tax. Significantly, the coup was also announced by Gillard just hours after Rudd and then Defence Minister John Faulkner had held a press conference to announce that Australia would be winding down its involvement in Afghanistan as soon as possible, amid growing popular outrage over the number of Australian deaths. Now, the key factional operators, the ones who gathered the numbers, were the US protected sources: Bill Shorten, Mark Arbib, and Union leader Paul Howes, shown speaking, I believe it was on Lateline, vowing the full support of the trade union movement for the ousting of Rudd. Now, the coup took the media and even the vast majority of Labor Party politicians by surprise. It did not take the US Embassy by surprise. Like Hadoyama in Japan, Rudd did not fight the moves against him. Instead, we can surmise that it was, at least partly, due to significant pressure on Labor Party members of Parliament and messages, if we could put it that way, conveyed to Rudd himself. Rudd, like Hadoyama, resigned on the morning of June 24th, 2010. Gillard was elected unopposed shortly after as the new leader and new Prime Minister. Now, when the political coup took place, we did not have the cables later published by WikiLeaks. But our World Party, the ICFI, and the World Socialist website was immediately conscious that far more was involved in Rudd's departure than his disagreeable personality or domestic politics. In our first major statement, published on June 28, 2010, The SEP Australia wrote in a statement, 35 years ago, in the midst of the last major global crisis of the capitalist system, the Whitlam Labor government was sacked in a coup involving the highest levels of the state apparatus, as well as intelligence agencies, including the American CIA. No doubt, these same forces were either directly involved in or at least had knowledge of the ousting of Rudd. Today, one of the central features of the geopolitical situation is the increasing tension between the US and China under conditions where Australia is economically dependent on China but politically subordinated to the United States. Throughout the South Pacific and Southeast Asian region, the so-called China factor is now a major issue in political affairs. Whether it played a part in the overthrow of Rudd remains to be seen, but the fact that Gillard is a member of the Australian-American Leadership Dialogue means that she is well known in Washington and the US foreign policy apparatus and has no doubt been vetted by the US security establishment. That was published on 28th of June 2010, headline The Australian Labor Party Coup, a warning to the working class. Now, on the morning of June 24th, Julia Gillard, in her first press conference, immediately repudiated the statements of Rudd the day before and promised that Australia's contribution to the Afghan war would continue unchanged, and she hailed the US alliance. She then appeared alongside the US ambassador with the US and Australian flags behind them and held a 20-minute private phone conversation with Barack Obama. Now, as we noted at our recent June 17 rally in defence of Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, the response of the Gillard Labor government to the publication of leaks exposing US war crimes and diplomatic intrigues was conditioned by her embrace of the anti-China turn in Washington. In December 2010, Gillard denounced WikiLeaks because behind the backs of the Australian population, her government was aligning Australia with US plans for an economic and strategic confrontation with the Chinese regime. The full extent of that alignment was revealed exactly 1 year later in the speech delivered by Barack Obama to the Australian Parliament on November the 17th, 2011. Barack Obama used his speech in the Australian Parliament to threaten China and announce what was described as the pivot to Asia, a massive US military build-up in the region, which included, for the first time in decades, the basing of US ground troops, US Marines, in the city of Darwin, as well as the stepped-up use of American ports and air bases by the US military. Our party stressed at the time the ruthlessness with which Rudd was ousted underlies what is at stake in Obama's offensive against China. Throughout the region, the ruling elites are wrestling with the same dilemma as their Australian counterparts: how to balance their burgeoning economic ties with China against the strident demands from the world's dominant military power to side with it on every issue, from trade to military basing and strategic planning. Amid the deepening global economic crisis, Washington will not tolerate any, even limited, independence on the part of allies like Australia, as it seeks to shore up American military and economic dominance across the Asia-Pacific region. We continued by opening up American military bases, ports and airfields to US troops, warplanes and warships. The Gillard government has put Australia and the Australian working class on the front line of any conflict between the US and China. The very real danger is that US imperialism's provocative diplomatic skirmishing will lead to clashes in a region filled with dangerous flashpoints, from the Korean Peninsula and Taiwan to the contested borders between India and China. That statement was published on the 19th of November 2011. Now, what has unfolded over the years since Obama had now announced the US pivot to Asia is the wholesale disciplining of the Australian political, strategic and corporate establishment. Virtually every critical voice in the ruling class to an alignment with the United States has been sidelined and marginalised. Figures like Malcolm Turnbull and Julie Bishop, who in 2011 and 2012 criticised aspects of the pivot to Asia, completely flipped their position once the coalition parties took government in 2013. Since 2013, the coalition has not only continued, but it has expanded Australia's alignment with Washington under both Tony Abbott and then under Turnbull. Now, we have to look at what the next major turning point in this process leading up to the foreign interference laws were. Certainly since November 2011, Australia has been in a full-scale military elite alliance with the US as it developed confrontation with China. But in July 2nd, 2016, the Australian ruling class was delivered what can only be described as a massive shock. The double dissolution election called by Malcolm Turnbull resulted for the first time in decades in a situation where no result could even be announced on election night. Such was the volatility of the voting patterns that there was no clear victor. Now on July 4th, 2016, in the assessment we published on the World Socialist website, the SEP noted that the election's outcome marked a definite turning point in a crisis that had been wrecking the Australian political establishment for at least the previous 9 years. Since the ousting of John Howard in the 2007 election, the post of Prime Minister had changed 5 times. We had seen the first minority government, the Gillard Green independent minority government, formed since 1941. And the entire political situation was mired in tremendous volatility. It took more than a week until July 10 before a new government could be announced, with the coalition clinging to power with just a 1-seat majority in the lower house and just 29 of the 76 seats in the upper house. We noted that the historic dimensions of the crisis, of the breakdown of the traditional two-party system, was expressed even more sharply in the underlying collapse or slump in the Labor Party vote. Despite the coalition losing significant numbers of seats and nearly losing government, Labor's share of the national vote barely increased from its 2013 loss and was the second lowest Labor ever received in its history. Now, what was the response in Washington to clear political instability in Australia? Well, it was immediate. Vice President Joe Biden was put on a plane and dispatched to Canberra for 4 days of top-level meetings from July 17th to July 21st, 2016. Standing alongside Turnbull after they'd had their private talks, Biden delivered a clear message to both the Australian establishment and to China. The US would be escalating its drive toward confrontation, and it was going to get Australian support. This is what Biden declared. Australia and the United States, we've had each other's back for a long time. We continue to have one another's back. And I assure you the United States is going nowhere. The United States is here in the Pacific to stay. We are a Pacific nation. We are a Pacific power, and we will do our part to maintain peace and stability in the region. He went on, describing the talks with Turnbull. We discussed the steps that Australia and the United States are taking so our troops can train more together and increase our interoperability so that we are fully prepared to respond to any challenges in the Pacific, i.e. China, with a united front. It's important we stand together. Then in a speech he delivered later that day, Biden delivered a blunt threat. He told the Australian establishment, if I had to bet on which country is going to lead economically in the 21st century, I'd bet on the United States. But I'd put it another way, it's never a good bet to bet against the United States. In other words, those in Australia and elsewhere, fearful over their business interests and economic ties with China, and no less fearful that a drive toward war will provoke popular unrest, those layers could expect to face wholesale American reprisals if they, quote, bet against the United States by failing to support the pivot to Asia. Now, literally within weeks of Biden making those statements and urging the Australian establishment not to bet against Washington, Malcolm Turnbull commissioned a, quote, joint investigation into alleged Chinese interference in Australian politics by the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation, ASIO, his own Department of Prime Minister, and the Department of Cabinet. The thoroughly US integrated Australian intelligence agencies worked in lockstep with the major corporate newspapers to launch a full-scale campaign against alleged Chinese agents of influence in Australian society. The campaign was spearheaded by the state-owned Australian Broadcasting Corporation, which on August the 29th, 2016, accused China of being responsible for the hacking of a defence research institution and Austrade, Australian Trade and Investment Corporation. One of the first targets of the establishment media was Labor Party Senator and factional power broker Sam Dastyari, who was labelled a, quote, Manchurian candidate on the floor of Parliament and a traitor in the Murdoch press after it was revealed he accepted a small donation from a Chinese company owned by an Australian citizen, and failed to declare it. The leading business journal, the Australian Financial Review, led the so-called exposure of Dastyari's dastardly relations with Chinese corporate individuals. Then on September the 2nd, a weekend edition, it published 11 separate articles, including a centre page spread, that in all varying ways accused China of undue influence within Australia and as a danger to Australia's national security. Days later, the Murdoch-owned Australian followed with its own editorial on September the 5th that declared that Australia had to, quote, root out the Chinese soft power push in Australia. The same day, and then in the print edition on September the 6th, the Sydney Morning Herald and its international editor, Peter Harcher, called for a full-scale political purge of those in politics and business who were accused of Chinese links. It is worth quoting from Peter Harcher's September the 6th column because it exemplifies the xenophobic, nationalist, profoundly anti-democratic and utterly manufactured character of the entire campaign and hysteria over Chinese foreign interference. This is what part of what Peter Hartcher wrote. Australia stands at a threshold moment. How much power are we prepared to allow the Chinese party state? Then he went on. Chairman Mao, the founding leader of the Chinese People's Republic, famously launched a hygiene campaign in 1958 called the Four Pests Campaign. Citizens were urged to eradicate rats, flies, mosquitoes and sparrows. Australia needs to wage a campaign of vigilance against foreign manipulation of democracy. In terms that Mao would have understood, perhaps a, quote, four pest campaign of our own is required to defend against agents of foreign influence. The rats, Hartcher asserted, were Australian politicians, the ones who should be eradicated. The rats were Australian politicians like Dastyari, who were hesitant about supporting a confrontation with China. The flies, who needed to be eradicated, were Australian academics and commentators, as Linda has raised, like former Premier, former Foreign Minister, and now leading academic official, Bob Carr, who advocates a similar policy to that raised by Rudd, that is, a compromise needs to be made in Asia between the US and China. The mosquitoes who need to be eradicated, Hartcher declared, were prominent Australian business people with major investments or export markets in China, such as James Packer, the casino mogul, and the heads of the major iron ore companies, people like Gina Rinehart and Twiggy Forrest. And the sparrows who had to be eradicated were Australians of Chinese descent and Chinese students studying in Australia, who Hartcher effectively accused of being a potential enemy fifth column. Pests, Hartcher concluded his article, who needs them? Now, the World Socialist website and the SEP warned in response to this type of language in one of the main daily newspapers in Australia. We warn that this is the language of political purges, police raids, mass arrests and internment camps for traitors and enemy aliens in the event of a war with China. And we noted that such repression has taken place in every previous war that Australian imperialism has embarked upon. Now, it is not coincidental that at exactly the same time as Peter Hartcher wrote those words, that on the other side, in the Northern Hemisphere in the United States, a campaign was unfolded in the American media to accuse Russia of seeking to influence the outcome of the November 2016 presidential election. On September the 5th, 2016, the Washington Post published an article claiming that the CIA, the FBI, the National Security Agency, and the Department of Homeland Security had started an investigation into a, quote, broad covert Russian operation in the United States to sow public trust in the upcoming presidential election and in US political institutions. Democratic Party candidate Hillary Clinton used that article to declare that there were, quote, credible reports about Russian interference in our elections and accused the Trump campaign of effectively being sponsored by Russia. Now, Clinton's ultimate defeat in the election, after Trump managed to win more electoral college votes despite Clinton getting 3 million more popular votes, was almost immediately blamed by the Democratic Party, sections of the US media, and then by the intelligence agencies on Russian interference. Those claims have been used, as the World Socialist website has documented extensively. We have a pamphlet available containing major statements. The claims of Russian interference became the launching pad for a sweeping assault on media freedom and democratic rights, above all centred on the censorship of critical voices on the internet. Internet conglomerates such as Google, in collaboration with the US state, is now censoring oppositional, anti-capitalist and socialist views from its search engine results. Internet conglomerate Facebook, likewise, is beginning wholesale censorship of its social media network. As we're about to witness, as Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin sit down for a summit, the claims of Russian meddling have been used to pressure the Trump administration to continue an aggressive foreign policy against Russia, risking the danger of war, even as the Trump administration dramatically escalates the US economic and military confrontation with China in this region. Now, in Australia, the anti-China hysteria of late 2016 was followed, predictably, by hysteria over members of Parliament holding, or even being eligible to hold, dual citizenship with other countries. In the first High Court ruling, which resulted in 5 members of Parliament being expelled because they were eligible for dual citizenship, the judges asserted that, quote, only those with unqualified allegiance to Australia could stand for, let alone hold office. As a result of the High Court rulings since late 2017, at least half the population of Australia, a country of immigrants, are not eligible to stand for federal parliament unless they, quote, renounce, a term in its own right, they have to renounce their historical family and cultural ties to another part of the world. Now, on November the 17th, 2017, exactly 6 years after the pivot to Asia was announced on the floor of Parliament, we commented in a perspective on the significance of the dual citizenship witch hunt. What was it all about? We wrote, the witch hunt over dual citizens in the Parliament emerged amid constant agitation in the establishment media for action to be taken against purported Chinese influence in Australian politics and society. This is part of a calculated attempt to create a wartime political atmosphere with all, quote, loyal citizens expected to wrap themselves in the Australian flag and demonstrate their fidelity to the nation. At the same time, the stoking of patriotism is motivated by the fear of the ruling class. It is a desperate attempt to cultivate a right-wing constituency that will defend the, quote, nation, that is the class interests of the capitalist oligarchs, from the inevitable eruption of struggle by the working class against the danger of war and social inequality. Our conclusion was, from the dual citizenship crisis, the consequences of the parliamentary crisis will be the refashioning of official politics. The long-standing two-party system dominated by the Coalition and Labor is disintegrating under the impact of immense geopolitical stresses and class antagonisms. As is the case across Europe and in the United States, the facade of democracy through which the capitalist class could rule in the past is breaking down. More and more openly, preparations are being made to dispense with it altogether and impose outright dictatorial measures. That's what we wrote on 17th of November 2017. Now, that assessment has been completely vindicated by the ramming through of the foreign interference legislation. What is the context in which these laws have been brought into effect? A constant procession of top-level American political and military figures have come to this country over the past years to insist that the alliance cannot be questioned and that Australia must support economic, diplomatic and military action against China. Just 2 examples. On June 17th, 2017, the former FBI Director James Clapper came to Australia, provided an audience of the political elite, and he declared, quote, "It is no secret that China is very active in intelligence activities against Australia, just as they are against us, and that China is increasingly aggressive in attempting to gain influence in your political processes as Russia is in ours. Then on May 10th, 2018, Hillary Clinton, the defeated Democratic Party candidate, but still top figure within that organisation, she travelled to Australia to promote her book alleging that Russia and WikiLeaks are responsible for the defeat of her right-wing militarist campaign. She came to Australia, and in Melbourne she lectured the Australian establishment that, quote, efforts under the radar are being made by China to influence Australian politics and policy. It is imperative for the Australian government to protect Australia's interests. This is an urgent problem and one we must confront immediately and together. While various figures, I could have cited John McCain, Admiral Harry Harris and numerous others, but several are enough. Now, while this was going on, the Trump administration, or the US military establishment to be more accurate, was drawing up a new US national security strategy. It was formally announced in January this year. It asserts that interstate strategic competition, not terrorism, is now the primary concern in US national security. Just repeat that. Interstate strategic competition is the primary concern of US national security. It names two countries in particular. China, it declares, is a strategic competitor using predatory economics to intimidate its neighbours while militarising features in the South China Sea. Russia, it declares, has violated the borders of nearby nations and pursues veto power over the economic, diplomatic and security decisions of its neighbours. The national security strategy concluded that the US must, quote, prioritise preparedness for war, above all by spending hundreds of billions of dollars to modernise and expand the already vast arsenal of American nuclear weapons. Now, this is a map prepared by the organisation antibase.org, simply to give a taste of the extent of US bases, access rights, communication facilities, and so on in Australia. Australia is so integrated with the US war machine that the US government and the American military take two things for granted. They assume it. One, that Australia's military will fight alongside American forces. In fact, it's reached the point where hundreds of Australian troops, military personnel, are integrated in various units of the American military. If they went to war, they would go to war. Secondly, the US military establishment assumes, takes for granted, that it can use this array of bases, naval bases, airports across northern Australia and so on, to fight a conventional war against China. And moreover, as they have for decades, the US government and military establishment assumes that the key US base, joint facility at Pine Gap in Central Australia, will be available for the United States to target its nuclear weapons, whether against China, Russia, or another country. The map, as I said, is simply to give one a sense of the scope of the military intelligence operations that the US conducts in this country. Now, these are the days we live in. Trump has threatened throughout this year to use, quote, fire and fury to, quote, totally destroy North Korea, a war he claimed could kill tens of millions if the North Korean regime does not submit to US demands and essentially agree to become a US client state on the borders of both China and Russia. He has torn up the Iran nuclear deal, raising the prospect of another, even more devastating war in the Middle East. Over the past month, the Trump administration has launched an open economic trade war against China. In fact, not only against China, against all of its major US allies in Europe and in other parts of the world. The US military is stepping up its periodic intrusions into Chinese claimed territory in the South China Sea. And this month, for the first time since 2007, it sailed warships through the highly sensitive Taiwan Strait. Amid the military provocations and social tensions, social inequality and social antagonisms have reached unprecedented dimensions. In this country, society is more unequal than ever before. The richest 1% of Australians control more wealth than the poorest 70%. Last year, wages growth reached its lowest level in recorded history at just 1.9%, far below the cost of living faced by millions of workers. Labor's share of national gross domestic product is smaller than ever before, while the proportion going to corporate profit is the highest ever. Now, this world situation and the situation within Australia is having an enormous impact on popular consciousness. Last month, the results of the most recent survey on political views in Australia, conducted by the polling agency YouGov Galaxy, were assessed by the right-wing think tank, the Centre for Independent Studies. In deeply alarmed language, the CIS headlined its report, quote, "Millennials and Socialism. Australian youth are lurching to the left." These were the findings. 58% of Australian millennials, that is, those defined as being born between 1980 and 1996, 58% said they had a, quote, "favourable view" when asked for their overall view of socialism. 59% agreed that capitalism has failed. In regional areas of Australia, country cities and towns, the figure was well over 70, was closer to 70%. The towns which have been ravaged by industrial shutdowns, the destruction of public services, towns such as where I grew up, Bendigo. And significantly, and to the absolute outrage of the CIS, more than 60% of young people agreed that, quote, "ordinary workers are worse off today than they were 40 years ago." In other words, capitalism offers them no future. Society is going backwards. Now, internationally, the conditions that give rise to such results in opinion polls, the conditions that face the mass of the working class, is giving rise to a growing radicalisation of workers and youth, and it is given rise to an eruption of strike action, of political protest, and in political interest in alternatives. 2018 has been marked by the re-entry of the working class into struggle internationally. From teachers across the southern states of the United States, to academics in the United Kingdom, to transport workers in France, construction workers across every major Chinese city, bank and transport workers in India, transport workers in Brazil, and this week, significantly, the first nationwide strike by nurses and health workers in New Zealand for 30 years. Now, the ruling class in Australia and its coalition and Labor servants and its servants in the trade unions know that they are sitting on a social powder keg. The descent into trade war that the Trump administration has initiated threatens to trigger the long-expected second global financial crash. A crash that will, unlike 2008, plunge Australia this time into severe recession and more than likely collapse the vastly inflated property market. That is the context in which the Coalition and Labor came together to ram through laws intended to suppress opposition to war and opposition to social inequality. The ruling class, in its desperation and its fear, is preparing to repress political opposition, and it is preparing to step up trying to use nationalist, xenophobic, anti-Chinese rhetoric to divert the working class from linking its social struggles with the development of an international anti-war movement. These laws are intended for use against those who oppose the Australian ruling class, dragging the working class of Australia into a war with China. Now, the struggle against these laws must be guided by a conscious perspective. An international movement must be built. An international movement that unites the working class in a common struggle for an end to the failed capitalist system and to the nation-state divisions that could lead to the destruction of human civilization. In this country, the working class must be unified with the working class of New Zealand, the workers of America, the workers of China, of Japan, of India, across Asia, in Europe, Africa and South America. That is what the SEP and our world movement, the ICFI, represent and fight for. Internationalism, the unity of the international working class. It is clear what must be done in response to the situation that confronts, or the onslaught we confront against democratic rights. A determined campaign must be undertaken by every opponent of imperialism and war, by every defender of civil liberties and freedom of speech, to alert and educate the working class as to the immense dangers that these laws pose to its interests. These laws cannot and should not be allowed to stand. They are illegitimate in the most profound sense of the word. They have been enacted behind the backs of the Australian people with no public debate. No one has voted for these laws. Most people do not even know about them, let alone what their implications are. Discussions need to be organised in the workplaces, at the university campuses, the TAFE colleges and the high schools, and preparations must be made. Preparations must be made for the necessary mass political and industrial action that must greet the first attempt to prosecute anyone under these outrageous anti-democratic laws. To the world audience watching this meeting on Facebook, and to those we hope will watch it and learn from it over the coming days, weeks and months, the most politically conscious response you can make to the international descent toward dictatorship and war is to join the SEP in the country where you live, or strive to establish a section of the International Committee of the Fourth International if one does not exist already there. To our Australian and New Zealand audience, including those of you here today in Sydney, I call on you to join the SEP in Australia and the Socialist Equality Group in New Zealand, which is working to become a section of the ICFI. Thank you very much.